27 so far, and I'm sure there'll be some more folks coming into class late. But anyway, let's see. Yeah, let's go ahead and get started. Anyway, I'm Jim Francis, and Barry Daniel and I are the party coordinators for Tidewater Chapter. And so I've got the spring and Barry's got the fall meeting. But anyway, before we get started with the program, I thought we'd do a warm-up exercise. And let's see, is John Davis in? I thought we'd give John Davis and Fred Gross a minute to talk about the plane and the lumber sale. And so let me see if John's. It doesn't look like John has joined us. So Fred, if you want to go ahead and take over and tell us about the lumber sale coming up.
Okay, glad to, and thank you for the time. I'll keep it short. Hopefully you've all got the handout. I'm going to share my screen. We'll see if that works here. And I think hopefully you can see that. Let me go to full screen mode here. Can you see that?
Yep, sure can.
Okay, we'll go through very quickly here. George Slack is a 18th century reproduction woodworker. Unfortunately, about 3 years ago, he had a stroke, and it doesn't look like he's going to be returning to the wood shop. It's a shame because he's a tremendous wood carver, excellent instructor. He taught a lot of students over the years and bought a bunch of wood back in 2009, 2010, when the Peruvian government was stopping legal exports of genuine mahogany. So he ended up with a lot more wood than I think he realized he was going to have. There's over 670 boards, or 19,000 board feet. Majority is mahogany, but a good bit of wide board, walnut, and a number of other secondary woods and all. I'm not going to go through, take any time. You can look at these later, but a lot of wood. All the different sizes are accessible through the different containers. We're obviously not going to sell wood at the bottom of the pile when we start the sales. It'll be in the basically the first top foot of the container to get at the wood. But we can get at all the different sizes. We even have some crotch mahogany, but not too many pieces of that. There's also among the mahogany, but unfortunately not separated into one stack, is a fair bit of very highly figured pattern boards mahogany. This just gives you a list. We have all different sizes. You can look at the list later. It won't take any time now. And a lot of wide boards, up to 50-inch wide. So mahogany, mostly we see in the 5/4 size for that width, but 12/4 also very wide boards for, say, Bombay chests. Walnuts, good size also. Some cherry and then pine and poplar too, which is not listed yet. So I think I've covered this. All the Peruvian mahogany is kiln dried. The walnut is air dried. We did some moisture checks. Most of it's this is back in December, in the 7 to 9% range. The owners have asked us to coordinate the sale for them. So we're asking, although I know some of you know George, we're asking no direct contacts with the owner due to health issues. Myself and the Lyman Grin staff are coordinating the sale, and we'll act as a contact with the owner. We're going to do it in small groups because the site is available via one-lane gravel road, and these shipping containers are in the back 49 of the property. We need to restrict the number of people at any one time, probably about 15 cars or so max. So we're going to set up some sales. We've asked people to register. Target customers, everything from, you want to buy 1 or 2 boards, as well as any small shop professionals. Of course, SAPFM members are key. And I've been presenting to a number of the regional chapters to alert them to the sale. I'm not going to go through this page. So pricing is the $64 question, obviously. We're going to do a % discount off of Irian prices. Somebody who will remain nameless suggested 50% off. This wood's becoming so rare, I don't think it's going to be that big a discount, but I'll be meeting with the owner next week to settle on prices. I won't go through that. So the wood sale is going to start the end of April. It's in Warrenton, Virginia. The cash or credit card, we're going to try to sort out some electronic payment methods also. It's outdoors, so it's going to be weather dependent. A lot of these boards are 10 footers. Some of them are as long as 14 to 18 foot. So think about transportation. We'll have facilities to cut boards on sites for easier transportation, but I know most people don't want to cut the boards. We'll also have some other tools for sale. We'll have that in a 3-car garage. The only thing we ask is that you sign up ahead of time so we can get an idea of the number of people. We're going to try to either set up appointment times or different dates for different groups to come up. So if you could send this information, there's my email ID. And we're going to try to do groups at a time, such as the Tidewater Chapter, the Blue Ridge Chapter, SAPFM. And if you want to bring a group up together at one time with a trailer or a truck, that might be the best way to do it. Something to think about. So that was it. Just wanted to give you the highlights, and we'll send, once we have sales dates set, we'll send out a package with the inventory list, with pricing, etc., directions to the property in an email prior to the sale. Also looking at, let's see if I stop sharing here. We're also looking at potentially trying to tie in with the SAPFM mid-year conference, but nothing's been established yet. So hopefully we'll be able to send something out to the registered members for the SAPFM meeting. But that would involve a trip up to Warrenton, Virginia at the end of the conference. That was it. Any questions?
All right. Thank you very much, Fred.
All right. Thank you, Jim.
I don't think John Davis is online, and but the note is that he's managing the sale of a number of wooden hand planes. And so you've got in the flyer, you've got his email address, and they're up in Manassas. Okay. So a couple of program notes. The first thing is Rick Robinson won't be able to join us today, but you've got his website and email address. And he's just a tremendously nice fella, very knowledgeable, very competent restorer and repairer of clocks and clock movements. And he's very exacting in his repair standards. And so if you're looking for a movement for your clock, either a shelf clock, a wall clock, or a tall case clock, he might be a resource that you could take a look at. In fact, I was over at his shop a few days ago, and he's probably got about 6 tall case clock movements from without the cases that he's got available for sale. And what he does is, if a person buys it, then he refurbishes it, brings it back up to spec, and then he'll give it to you. Well, he'll sell it to you. So anyway, that's the story on Rick. Aspen Golan, she emailed me, and she came down with strep throat on Thursday. And so she's on the injured reserve list for today. And then we're going to hold off on Ben Hobbs' discussion of the Thomas White clock, probably until the fall meeting. And that will give Ben a chance to take a close look at the clock itself and work up sketches and dimensions and plans and take pictures and things like that. So, that'll be Thomas White is a fellow that's got an interesting history, and so I think it'll be a worthwhile discussion if we held it off until fall time. Okay, for protocol for today's meeting, probably the best thing to do is if you've got questions, go ahead and type those into chat. And then as we go through, then we'll go ahead and relay the questions to the presenter. And then at the end of the discussion for that particular presenter, you can go ahead and unmute and ask any final questions that you've got. With regard to future plans, if there are items during this meeting that will require follow-up questions, things like that, we'll play it by ear. I hope to use the updated SAPFM website. It's got tremendous capability, especially in the forums area, and there's one for clocks, to use the capabilities of the website as much as we can. And then we can also, if need arise, we can schedule a Zoom meeting for a particular topic or an in-person meeting to cover those areas. So I think that's about it. We're recording this Zoom session, and it should be we'll send it up to be plugged into the SAPFM website, and it'll be under our chapter. So that's about it for program notes. Any questions at this point? Okay. Well, let me to get things kicked off, let me introduce Jeff Aid. Jeff started out in the corporate world, Northrop Grumman, and then migrated into the antique business. And he and his wife, Sue, have a antique business, and they specialize in antique clocks and watches. And so you can see their inventory. They used to have a storefront. They've closed that down. And so they operate out of their website, Dovetail Antiques. And so Jeff his basement is full of clocks, and he can talk endlessly about clocks. And so certainly a very good resource for today's discussion. So Jeff, if you would, go ahead and take the floor and tell us about antique clocks, what's hot and what's not, and some of your favorite tall case and shelf and wall clocks. Okay?
Okay, well, thank you, Jim. Jim's right. I spent my corporate world and we retired in 2005, built a house in Williamsburg. So we stayed real close to history and got to know the curators at Colonial Williamsburg and have visited their collection many times. They have a Home Depot type warehouse with all their furniture and their home goods, and so collections in Williamsburg, and it's a fascinating place. And around the edge of the building, they have probably 200 to 300 tall case clocks. And as Jim said, we got bored when we retired in 2005 and opened an antique business. We had a store for 10 years, and now we do antique shows. So we pack up our clocks and go traveling around the Mid-Atlantic region and buy, sell, and restore antique clocks and pocket watches. So a variety is very important. We specialize in a number of woodworks clocks, early American clocks around 1800, 1825, 30. The makers, we did not have brass in the United States, so everybody here made their clock mechanisms out of wood. And Eli Terry, we always give Henry Ford the accolades for his, moving line, building Ford Model Ts, where Eli Terry actually perfected that 100 years before. And he worked with a couple other guys, Seth Thomas and Silas Hoadley, and they had a contract to build woodworks clocks, which they completed and built about 3,000 in the early 1800s. And from there, the American clock industry really sprang forward. At the same time, you may have heard of the Willards. We were all Englishmen, of course, at that point in time. And the Willards came over and established a business outside of Boston in Roxbury. And they were making traditional English tall clocks. There's still a Willard Museum up there. And they trained a number of apprentices who continued that work with brass mechanisms. And they're very, very sought after today. If any of you, I don't know where this group is, but if there's anybody in New England, in Bristol, Connecticut, is the American Clock and Watch Museum, which has a huge variety and a number of Willard pieces on display. Our organization is the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors, and that is headquartered in Columbia, Pennsylvania. And the museum there also has a very, very fine collection of early clocks and great collection of pocket watches. But for the sake of the clocks, you can find the early woodworks as well as brass shelf clocks. So it's a very interesting business today. We, of course, like antiques everywhere, had a good dip after 2008 in prices, and a lot of the folks who had collected for years in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and so forth, I'd say in the last 5 to 10 years have been passing away, and these phenomenal collections have been coming on the market. So clocks that I'll say 10 years ago I could only hope to find, now when I go to a clock auction, you might find 2 or 3 of them. So it's a very unique situation where the market seems to be rebounding simply because of the aging out of the earliest collectors. We're finding that in the last few antique shows that we've done, younger folks in the 30s and 40s and 50s, if you want to consider that young, are now in the process of looking at clocks and antique furniture, for that matter, as a viable alternative today to, a battery-operated piece you'd find in Walmart as a clock, or, IKEA furniture, for that matter. So hopefully some of the older things are becoming appreciated again, and we're seeing an uptick currently. And hopefully every reason for that to continue. Certainly the quality and the uniqueness of early timepieces sets them apart from a battery operated piece. Although the maintenance issues and so forth, it requires some understanding, basic understanding and knowledge. And we often get the comment when we talk to people either in our store or currently at the shows, oh, I'm afraid I'll break it. And I always tell folks, hey, look, this thing's been around a couple 100 years. Short of dropping it, or it coming to harm, there's nothing you're going to do operationally that's going to break it. It's going to survive and outlive you. Like changing the oil in your car, clocks, mechanical clock, needs to be oiled, I'll say, every 4 years or so. Today we use a synthetic lubricant, similar to, if you will, to Mobil 1 in a car. We have actually used Mobil 1 itself. And that really extends the life of a mechanical clock quite a bit. As Jim said, I work with Rick now. I was up in Williamsburg at the Williamsburg Clock Shop for about 12 years. The fellow that owned that closed and went to England, where he does the same work over there. And so knowing Rick, I've gone down to Carrollton. I've been there a couple of years and do a lot of restoration work on the clocks that we sell. And our theory has always been, when you buy a clock or a pocket watch from us, it's operating the way it was designed back in 1800. So hopefully that's a good enough introduction. If there's anything else, just let me know.
So talk to us about the wooden movements as far as who some of the leading makers were and things like that.
Okay. Well, the woodwork process in the United States was unique and complete in Connecticut. That's because there were enough rivers. They had water wheels that provided the power. And Eli Terry was the fellow who really started the whole thing. So if you're going to collect clocks, you probably want an Eli Terry in your collection. And what they did, of course, is the way that he fulfilled his first contract and all the makers thereafter would take a log. In a lot of cases, they used apple. Mahogany was available, but expensive. They dried it for about a year, shaped it to a long pole kind of a situation, sliced it and used a gear cutter to cut the required number of teeth. And the vast majority of the clocks were two trains, which meant that it had a time train on the right as you looked at it, and a strike train on the left, with a set of levers that went across from the gears. When the time side rolled around and it lifted a lever and said, okay, now get ready to strike. And when it clicked off, of course, your clock would strike. Same process was used whether it was wood or brass. The design basically was the same. A woodworks clock is really kind of neat because the gears, if you can see my hands, were kind of sloppy. The gears muddled around with each other. Brass, they were very tight and very specifically fit together. So you have less play. Well, woodworks clocks are around today because the slop in the wood gearing allowed them not to have a lot of friction. And most of the clocks I find, I'll say at least 80% of the gears are original, maybe with a tooth here or there replaced. Because again, the amount of time that the two leaves on a gear would touch each other is a fraction of a second. So you really did not get a lot of wear, and therefore the gears lasted if they were dried well. Eli Terry, Seth Thomas, Silas Hoadley, those were the three guys that really started it all off. Another one joined them, Riley Whiting. And all of those people are ones that are highly collectible today if you can find an early American woodworks. Most of the cases started out, all of them had a wood dial. And believe it or not, most of them had pewter hands because they would go to the local silversmith and have him fill molds with each of their unique designs and styles. So Eli Terry had a style with a diamond in it out at the end of the hand. Riley Whiting had kind of like a half moon with a point. So they had a trademark look to some degree with their pewter hands. They had folks who painted the dials for them. And when you went in and you could commission a clock and say at the top of the dial up by the number 12, I want you to paint my house in, or something like that. Some of the makers signed their dials, and that would be the only identification on the clock as far as who would have made it. There was nothing on the movement or in the case usually. When the Willards also started in the late 1700s and early 1800s in Roxbury outside of Boston, they did the brass, just like the English clockmakers. And they also signed the dials. And you had Simon and Aaron Willard, two brothers. One of the fellows who was an American who apprenticed with them went in, and there were a number of apprentices, and they would come into Roxbury, apprentice, and then go out and build their own clocks. And they would always be, at that point in time, brass. So after the War of 1812, the American clock making generally evolved from wood to brass. And because once we were friends with England again, that's where we got our brass. And then we became clockmakers in this country in earnest. There were 7 American clock companies in Connecticut that formed the basis of the industry. And they started by buying out all of the individual men who were producing on their own and labeling their shelf clocks. And we're making wood and brass shelf clocks primarily, with a number of tall case clocks. Tall case clocks, of course, being more expensive. As America expanded, we generally had to have smaller clocks that could be put in the carriage and the wagon and go west. So you had a variety of woodworks clocks that went west. And then when the brass came in after 1835 or so, those clocks were much more compatible to being moved. And they were all one-day clocks. In the 1840s, we started to build clocks that ran a week. And that, of course, was the big marketing pitch at that point. So your tall case clocks and the shelf clocks evolved to an 8-day instead of a 30-hour. So that was obviously much more convenient. And it was, like going to your next iteration of the iPhone today. The technology was a big leap. So the brass became a big, big play, and an 8-day clock became a bigger play. And in order to get 8 days, we did not have good steel at that time for springs. So we used a weight driven with pulleys on the side, and the weights came down the side. And they geared a clock with usually 4 wheels in the time train and strike train, which enabled, with the pulley system, a clock weight to drop long enough to get a week out of it. And those became very fancy. They had paintings in the glass in the front, originally a wood dial, and then they went to a metal dial. Zinc was the metal of choice at that time. And we continued to evolve. When the Industrial Revolution came around, we were making thousands of clocks in the 1850s. And some of the bigger makers actually exported them to England, where the movements, the 8-day movements, were put into wood cases of very fancy, called Anglo-American cases, and they were re-imported to the United States. So it was quite an interesting evolution. Jim, I don't want to go on forever, but does that answer some of the questions or take you where you wanted to go?
Yeah, Ronnie, you're holding up a clock face.
Yeah, this is what he was just discussing. It's on zinc.
Right.
Painted on the front.
Yes.
The double trains got 2 winder holes.
Mm-hmm.
Came off of an antique. I don't know. I save anything like that I find, and I found this in a shop I bought out, and I believe it's from that period.
Correct.
All right. So Jeff, if a person is looking for a used movement, what are the things that he should look for with regard to being able to buy one that can be brought back up to speed and work reliably?
Well, if you go on eBay today, for instance, you can see a wide variety of clock movements. So the real answer to your question is, what kind of clock do you want to build to begin with?
Okay.
If it's a tall case clock, that's an entirely separate and distinct style and type of mechanism from any kind of a shelf clock. A lot of the mechanisms you will see on eBay are repurposed brass 8-day movements or possibly 30-hour movements, one-day clocks that came out of shelf clocks. And I always tell folks, look at the width of the spring. I'm going to hold if you have a spring that's about, what's that, maybe 3/8 of an inch thick versus a good 1/2 inch, that means the smaller spring is a one-day clock. And if you want to build an 8-day, you're going to look at the wider spring. So you want to see it from the side so you can see the width of the springs. It's important too, I was talking to the other Jim Francis, I don't know if he's on currently, but when you want to build a tall case clock, the most critical part is to have the dial, because the bonnet on the clock, on the inside of it, has a frame, or should have a frame, that fits the dial. So they were made for each other. Many times I've seen a lot of clocks where somebody's gone out and purchased, Ronnie, the one you just showed, a square dial of some description, but they have one with an arch on the top. So, or they want to build that. So you need to make sure you know what you're looking at. And then the winding holes in your dial need to align with the arbors that you're going to wind in there. So it's always best, if you're building a tall case or a shelf clock, to make sure that you've purchased the dial and the movement at the same time, and you know they fit each other. Then you'll have the proper dimensions for building a wood case around that. And I always tell folks, the other thing with either a wood movement or a brass movement is make sure you have the pendulums on and you can see it swinging. So you know the clock, yeah, there you go. So you know the clock is operational. Now it can be restored, we can rebush it, build it like it was new. That's not a problem, but you want to make sure it's got all the pieces and it is operational to begin with. Whether it works well or not is absolutely immaterial, because Rick or myself, a clockmaker, can go ahead and rebuild that.
Now, Jeff, with a wood, but are the arbors metal or are they also wooden?
They're wood.
Oh, okay.
There's only one piece, one gear, if you will, in the clock that is brass. And every clock has a little thing that swings back and forth. It's called the verge. That's always steel. And that's when it goes in and out of the teeth, it skips off the teeth. That's where you get tick, tock, tick, tock. That's where the noise comes from. In a woodworks clock, the gear that fits in that is brass. That's called the escape wheel. And that's always got to be metal, because it's got metal pallets on the verge. Okay. Everything else in a woodworks clock is wood. Back plates, front plates, all the gears, all the teeth, everything, all the arbors.
And that wood is typically a fruit wood, but even the front and back plates.
Well, they were made, a couple of the makers, the answer to the question is they could be any kind of wood. It was a hardwood that was, fired, kiln dried or whatever. Some I have seen the fellows who wanted to make the really nice ones, either a tall case or a shelf clock, would use mahogany plates. So I've seen those, and rare, but they're out there. The most unique woodworks clock to find, and I would certainly say if you're going to build one, is an 8-day woodworks. As the 30-hour woodworks clocks were transitioning to brass, some of the makers said, no, I don't need to go to brass. I can still make them out of wood. I will make an 8-day clock out of wood, and it'll be half price of your brass clocks. So they thought, as in marketing never changes, they thought they had a distinct advantage there to use the existing technology and make an 8-day woodworks clock. That eventually did fade out as, the entire industry went to brass.
Now that woodworks clock, would it have a brass spring or would it have weights?
Weights.
Oh, okay.
Yep. Yeah, there were no, at that point in time, springs came in strongly around 1840, 45, somewhere in there. We had to learn how to make steel and make it well. The initial springs, believe it or not, for a year or two were actually made out of brass. And as you can guess, with brass, after a little bit of use, it loses its tension. So the brass did not work well. And every now and then you can still find a spring-driven brass clock. And that's more of an 8-day brass clock with brass springs. It might run 2 or 3 days, that's it.
Okay.
Okay.
Now, are there typical repairs that you have to complete on all clocks that come in to be worked to bring them back up to speed?
Yes. Most clock, the vast majority of folks never service a clock or oil it. And just like your car, a clock should have routine oiling every 4 years. We use a synthetic lubricant today instead of the old mineral-based oils. So that lasts a lot longer and protects a lot better. But every plate on a clock has little holes where the pivots come through, and the bushing around that, the pivot is steel and the bushing is brass. And Ronnie's got a perfect example. Yes, he's hitting all the pivots. So where that steel pivot comes through the brass is where the steel will wear the little brass bushing into an egg shape instead of a circle. And that's when it starts to bounce in there and you lose the ability for the clock to run. So it needs to be oiled on each of those pivots every 4 years or so. And we recommend every second time that you take it apart and clean it. And there's the oiler. Perfect. You're a good clock guy.
Talk about the verge. Here's a picture of the verge.
Yeah, can you hold it up and show them the verge again?
Here it rocks back and forth in the gear.
Yes.
Tick tock, tick tock.
That's it.
Yep.
So in a woodworks clock, that wheel that goes around is the only wheel that's made out of brass. The verge, of course, is steel, so that you can get a consistent tick tock and the cadence. That's the important thing with a clock, is that the cadence stays even so the clock will run. And that's called putting the clock in beat. It's like your heart. If your heart's out of beat, you're going down too. If a clock is out of beat, it will stop. So it's very, very important that you have the clock in beat. That's an easy thing to do. Every clock is a little bit different, but there's a little brass piece that runs down that holds the pendulum, and you bend it left or right, and that sets the beat. We can go into clockwork. Yeah, if you hold that still, see the pendulum that he's got his finger on, and the part that comes down and has a 90-degree angle and holds it, that part that comes down is called the crutch. And you adjust that either left or right by bending it slightly, and it's meant to be bent. And that will, until you hear an even tick tock, tick tock. Yeah, okay. It's the brass shaft on the left that swings the pendulum. Perfect.
So needless to say, when you put your clock in the house, either wall or shelf or on the floor, it's got to be level in one direction or both directions.
Well, it's got to be level. And your wall, we find many houses, my house is a perfect example, was built in 2005, and I don't think I have a vertical wall in the house. They all have a little bit of lean either back or forward. So your clock has to be adjusted. You know, you put little felt pads underneath the bottom or the top if it's a wall clock, so it hangs vertically. And then of course you adjust it left or right. So you hear your ear is your prize. Tick, tock, tick, tock. If it's tick tock, tick tock, tick tock, it's going to stop. That means it's out of beat. So you know, people say to me when they come to shows, I just had my clock done, the clock guy did it, and it doesn't run. Now, that's commonly called user error. When you bought a clock back in 1820, 18 anything, 1900, you bought the clock, you took it home, you put it in your wagon, you went over the road 20 miles to your homestead. I can promise you there wasn't a table, a wall, a floor, or anything that was level. So you, as the owner, needed to know how to set the beat. It was your responsibility since it was your clock. And they explained it all to you when you bought it. But there wasn't a clock guy that all of a sudden decided to make house calls to set the beat for you. And people want me to come do that all the time. Rick is a really great guy. If he's got a problem with a clock, he'll go do that if it's on his route for his house calls on a Monday. I gave up with that. I'd spend all day going around the countryside to set the beat on a clock, especially when you get to an assisted living home and all the folks in there have one or two clocks that are perfectly fine, but they don't know how to run them. So setting the beat is important, and that's nothing more than bending that little piece once you've looked at the movement. Thank you.
How much difference is there having a clock on an outside wall or an inside wall?
None at all. You know, people used to say humidity. Brass doesn't know that. Clocks don't possess intelligence. The only time I have seen anything is in a very, very humid, like Florida, situation where in a woodworks clock, you start to lose some of the play between the teeth in a woodworks gear. It doesn't happen with brass. The humidity or the temperature doesn't have any effect. Now, the only difference to that is there's one clock that some of you may know, it's an Atmos clock. And an Atmos is a brass and glass clock that runs on the barometric pressure. So as the barometer rises and falls, the speed of the clock adjusts itself. But that's how that is powered. That's a different discussion altogether.
Yeah.
Yes.
A tall clock. This is going to be a stupid question, I'm sure, but the case, you level on the side of the case on a tall clock and the front of the case, but what about the saddle itself? I mean, obviously you want your case to be look level or looks, standing upright straight. But then the question is the works inside level?
Yes. Great question. We use clock levels that are about 2 inches long, the little things. And take your bonnet off on a tall case clock, put that little one on the seat board. And the seat board goes between the sides of the clock and the mechanism is on that. Okay, so whenever you have whether it's a brand new tall case clock, a Howard Miller you go out and buy, or one that was made in 1750, every tall case had a seat board that the mechanism was mounted on.
Right.
Okay. So you want to take there's your little level. You want to put that in front of the mechanism on the seat board, and then put it on the side running lengthwise and widthwise. And that way, what you're leveling is the clock mechanism as opposed to the case. So if you need to shim the seat board up on one side or the other, or front to back, you can shim the appropriate corner or side until you get it level.
Okay.
Does that help? So
Yes, thank you.
in a tall case, your seat board is your barometer. That's what helps. Okay,
Thank you.
sure, you're welcome.
Now, Jeff, tell us a little bit about the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors.
Well, the NAWCC is very reasonable. I think it's $85 a year to join. Their headquarters is in Columbia, Pennsylvania, outside of Lancaster or York, if you know where that is. A really very thorough museum. We have chapters, probably like your group. We have local chapters. I'm in the same one that Rick is in. And the local chapters have regional meetings, and then we have a national every year. Our group in Virginia just hosted the national meet this year. It was held in Hampton, Virginia. And so folks came from all over the country, and we have a mart where you can buy, sell, and find clocks, parts, equipment, and so forth. And then we have a number of lectures. Rick and I and some other folks put on an auction where there are clocks that are donated, or some are donated for the national, the funds go to the national. Some, or if you just have one you want to sell or a group, you can put them in the auction, and there's a small fee, to do that. So it's a very diverse group. We're starting, and I use this very loosely, to attract younger folks. The sad part is, as with most organizations, I think, most of our folks are 60 plus. So we have a declining balance. And there's an awful lot of clocks as a result of that are coming on the market. But it's a very, very good organization. When you join, you have access to all of the records. They will provide answers to any questions. I always tell folks when we travel to antique shows and they say, how do I find a local clock guy? NAWCC.com. When you go online or you call them, they can tell you who's in charge of the local chapter and fixing clocks in your area. So it's a very, very good organization dedicated to the preservation of timepieces. And I say clocks because we're talking about clocks, but pocket watches, wristwatches, all that is incorporated too.
All right. So Jeff, tell us about your granddaughter clock that you've got sitting at the front door of Rick's shop.
Okay. Well, there's the proper term for a clock that stands on a floor is a tall case clock. The proper term. We call them grandfather clocks. There are 4 sizes. There's a granddaughter, a grandson, grandmother, and a grandfather. The smallest one is the granddaughter, and that's about 4.5, maybe 5 feet tall. The grandson is 5 feet, 5.5. Grandmother's about 6. And then you all know a grandfather, which is a taller clock. The granddaughters were 90% of them were made in England. And if you can imagine any home that you've ever lived in, you have a set of stairs that goes up, a landing, and then the stairs turn the other way to go up to the second floor. Well, the English, who could not afford a tall clock, a proper tall clock, on their landing, they started to make, in the early 1900s, the granddaughter and grandson clocks that would fit on the landing. The interesting thing, that was when Westminster chiming, and you've all heard that da 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 da. That's when that came into vogue and was incorporated into a clock mechanism, in addition to just time and strike on the hour. So when the English made their granddaughter and their grandson clocks, they put them on the landings, and as a result, whether you were upstairs or downstairs, you could hear them. And of course, you had a little bit of music. The more sophisticated mechanisms also added the St. Michael's chime, the Whittington chime. You started to get into 3 chimes in one clock. Now, the mechanism itself was only about yay big. It was like the one that Ron held up size-wise. It had an extra barrel in it in the center, which was the time. The chime, the music was on the right side, and the strike on the hour was on the left. And those little clock mechanisms were put in a taller case, even though they were only this big, so that they could be put on the landings and be visible, if you will. So I have one that's a customer of mine down at Rick's right now. We have restored it to get the chiming right. And as you can imagine, after about 100 years or so, the springs start to lose their tension. So what was a 7 or an 8 day clock now maybe is a 5 day clock. And this one needed attention. It's a very nice piece. And there you go. And if Ron, put your finger on the 3 winding arbors.
Here,
That's
here,
strike, that's time, and that's the chime. And you can see the hammers that play the music down below. And Whittington, or let's start out Westminster chime, when you see a clock that has 4 hammers, little rods with the hammers on the end, that plays simply the Westminster. When you have the 8, that's when you could get into the Whittington and the St. Michael's, which were an 8-note tune. And each quarter hour, you started out at quarter after with 4 or 8 notes. And each quarter hour, you added 4 or 8 more until you got up to 16 for the Westminster and 32 for the Whittington, and then it would strike the hour. The lever that's hanging off to the right there is your tune selection. And you could pick which one you wanted by doing that. Now, when you see a mechanism of that type and style and the little plastic tips on the end of the hammers instead of leather, you know you've got a newer mechanism. And here's all the plastic tips. The lever on the left side was your silence. So if you didn't want to hear it, and a lot of folks, I don't know why they buy a chiming clock, but they don't want to hear it play, they turn it off. So then it doesn't engage. That does not hurt the mechanism. It will keep thinking that it's operating, although you've stopped the levers from functionally going.
some of the more modern methods.
Yes, these are modern. I don't run it. You're breaking up. I didn't know exactly what you said.
Some of the more modern ones have a lever that stop it from 10 o'clock at night till it starts in at 7 in the morning, so you don't have to listen to it at night.
Exactly. Yes. So, but
So
anyway,
with
so
with
there.
that granddaughter clock, would it sit on a small table or would it be directly on the floor?
No, it's always got to be on the floor. Yeah. Otherwise, you'd be winding it way over your head.
Oh, yeah, good point.
Okay.
What about the glass door? Is that something unique for that particular clock or?
Well, you could, again, keep in mind back in the day, all through the 17 and 1800s and into the early 1900s, you ordered a clock. So you could actually go into a clock guy, you had a book, and you picked out what kind of door you wanted, what kind of dial you wanted, what style of hands you wanted. That was always, it's kind of like buying a car. You check off the option list. So you could buy different dials. I don't know if you saw that one, but it's basically a brass dial. I resilvered the chapter ring where all the numbers are. It's called the chapter ring. There you go. And then you have the brass designs in the corners, some of which are embossed in the brass plate. Others are added onto with either screws or pins onto the brass dial. Now, hold that up again, Ron. At the number 6, let's go down to the 6. So it's, you can see, oh, actually 5 and 7 are very good. You can see where there's wear to the silvering. So in a lot of cases, that chapter ring comes right off of the brass plate. New black wax can be put in for the numbers, and the silver itself can be resilvered. And we do that in the shop. So all of that, the one that you saw, Jim, has been resilvered. I resilvered it and polished all the brass. So it's basically back to as new. Yeah, so you can see where the 1 to 10, where the silvering has been worn off right there, and that could be resilvered. And usually when the silvering is done, it comes out as a matte finish. Now the English didn't like that, so when they resilvered one, it was shiny. So you have the matte or the shiny finish.
Moon dial. This one doesn't have a moon on it. It would have had a moon dial.
Moon dial in there, right? Excellent. Any other questions? That piece, by the way, let me make another comment. The other Jim Francis and I think it's Annapolis, called me one day, and that dial would be what you want to have if you're going to make a tall case clock case, because that outline and dimension is where the frame of the inside of the bonnet will fit up against. And you want that framework to match your dial dimensions. So it looks like it was made properly and at the same time. Yes, you can see the wood frame around. Open the door. Okay, now that just has a space, and that space between the dial and the frame of the bonnet is where there was originally a wood, I'll call it a picture frame. It was just a flat piece of wood that framed the dial, was mounted to the wood case and framed the dial, so when it was in there, it looked finished. Similar to the front of that door. You know, it looks like it fits. Nice fretwork. Hey, hand me my phone. I'm going to hold up a picture on my phone. I hope this, I'm not at home, unfortunately. So I don't have any of this available. But if I hold this up, is that showing? Yeah, okay. This is a clock made by Frederick Wingate, who is the only American clock manufacturer who apprenticed with the Willards up in Connecticut. And he was the only fellow that used a label, big label inside his case as an advertisement. And I'm gonna try and blow that up. Hopefully you can see it. He signed the dial, Augusta, Maine, and then he numbered the clock dial. And inside the case, this particular one even has a moon dial on it. He numbered inside the case in chalk 233, inside the bonnet in chalk 233, and then on the dial. And his claim to fame was, again, I'll hold this up to, hopefully you can see this. He did not use one single type of wood. He used, in this particular case, cherry was very popular because we had cherry. That was the American wood of choice. Jim did a wonderful job restoring the base on the clock. It has bird's eye maple banded in mahogany. And this door is the same way in the throat. And it's really terrific. It has mahogany at the top, some beautiful fretwork, and a big label inside. I'll see if I have a picture of the label. But in any case, I don't know, just so your choices with clocks are all over the board. I thought I had a picture.
So
Oh,
it
sorry.
looks
Nope.
like Ronnie is showing a clock that's got a little bit of a frame around there again.
Yeah, this
Yes.
is, he was talking about a frame around it.
Yeah.
Right,
This is
Yes.
wood in here.
right.
So when you close it up, really the dial should come all the way out to the wood, but it doesn't on this particular clock. So I put a mask in there around it.
Mhm.
It's a copy of an Aaron Willard clock.
Right. This is a Silas Hoadley Woodworks dial. Let me, sorry, Eric. Oops. So that's an American tall case dial painted in a grain painted case. Now you'll notice it looks like you wind this one up. It's got the little winding ports. Can everybody see that kind of? It's a fake. You actually pulled cords inside it. And this is what the clock actually looks like. And I'm going to blow it up. Hopefully you can see that. It's painted to look like mahogany or rosewood. And that's how they kind of faked it back in the day, to think you were getting an expensive clock, when in fact it was nothing but a pine box painted and had fake winding holes, because the people who bought the big moneyed clocks, of course, had a wind up. So I'll try. I have a picture here, if you'd like to see it, of a tall case Woodworks clock. See if I can, of a movement. There's what the movement looks like on the outside. And that white, the shaft in the center is where the hands attach, right there. Here's what the gears look like. This is a side shot. And you can see everything is made out of wood. There's a little more of a close-up. Even the posts that hold it together are wood. Right in the center, the silver part, that's the verge, the tick-tock part. And the wheel that engages it, the escape wheel, is the only brass wheel in the clock. Fun to make.
Any Any other questions for Jeff?
Jeff, thanks a lot for showing this. I've learned quite a bit today. I really appreciate it.
You're more than welcome.
Is there a problem that you see with using a modern movement?
In a modern movement, no, as long as you service them. After the war, well, let's see if I can hold my finger. Prior to the war, plates were about that thick, the brass plates. After the war, they went down to half of that. You can almost bend them. If you're strong enough, you can. And what that means is when the steel shaft, the little pinion, went through the brass, if you did not lubricate that frequently enough, it wore the bushing egg-shaped and the thing bounced in there. And the brass isn't really thick enough to hold a new bushing. So the antique clock mechanisms, yeah, there's a beauty. That's a nice, wide, thick, heavy plate. And those can be rebushed in perpetuity. They were designed to be rebuilt again and again and again. The new ones after World War II that Ron held up with the chiming leaf, the brass plates on that one, if we can, are much thinner. And in a lot, this brass plate that's running north-south is much thinner. And in some cases, the German mechanism, well, the Chinese, the Korean, and the Japanese mechanisms were so thin that you couldn't put a bushing in and have the bushing hold. The bushing was thicker than the plate was that was trying to hold it. So it didn't work. The German ones, you got a 50-50 shot. And that was a German movement that Ron just held up. So it's always a crapshoot as to whether they can be rebuilt. And the theory that the Germans came up with was you took it out, you threw it away, and you put a new one in. And they generally last between 20 and 25 years with no maintenance. And most people don't oil them. So that's the upside and the downside. The old one, there's a beautiful little bushing, and you can see how thick. Yes, you can see how thick those are. Move to your left a little, Ron. To get in the camp. There you go. So the plate has to be that thick for the bushing to fit properly. If the plate's too thin and the bushing's sticking out, it won't work. When you have, this is an example of an old clock. You've all seen these, an old beehive. And that has a mechanism in it that was made in 1870. So that one can be rebuilt forever and ever and ever. Okay. Same with the woodworks. Woodworks can be rebuilt forever and ever and ever, as long as you guys are around.
One question came up, Jeff, for the wooden gears in clocks. Is there a particular grain direction in the gear itself?
And that's a good question. The see, the grain was, I would say it's, you guys would know the terminology better. I would say it's probably cross grain, if that's making sense. But you always tried to get the grain so that you had the strongest part of it taking the pressure of the gears, the leaves on the gears, bouncing off each other. There's no tension or pressure otherwise on it. So that's not a good answer, but if that's your gear and you lose these three teeth because they finally weaken and snap off down here at the base, we cut out down here, usually on an angle like this, so you can press it in, and then you shave the leaves, new leaves, you form them to fit the replicas, around them, the ones that came off. I have seen in some clocks the leaf break off falls to the bottom of the case. And some of the epoxies today actually will work well enough to hold the leaf by putting it back on. I don't necessarily recommend that unless you're not going to run the clock. And a lot of people don't run their clocks, they have them for decoration. Drives me crazy, by the way, but you know, that's the way a lot of folks handle their clocks. Somehow I think, Ron, you probably run your clocks.
Yeah. And I've only repaired a wooden clock before, and what you want is to have teeth, straighten the grain going through the teeth, not across the teeth. If they go across the teeth, they'll break. And a lot of times you'll see a center disc with individual teeth set in the central disc so that they're all straight grain.
Right.
And the ones I repaired, they were either cherry or dogwood. Dogwood's excellent for anything like this because it's so straight grain, it's tough, and they use it for shuttles. In weavers use it for shuttles, and it wears really well. So a dogwood toothed wooden geared clock would be
Yeah, the interesting part too, a lot of the old makers, as they began to learn more back in, I'll say, the late 1820s and early 30s, started to advertise bushings instead of being made out of wood, being made out of ivory. So it's not unusual to see a woodworks movement. You take the big old thing out and you see these little white discs around the plate, and you have one with ivory bushings. Today, we have done some of those. Believe it or not, we actually use antler, because ivory's, forbidden. But if you're really a good carver, you can take a shaft of an antler, trim it down in your lathe so you have the right diameter, slice it off, fit it in the woodworks hole in the plate, and then drill a hole through it for the pivot. And that'll outlast all of us.
All right. Well, we're running after 11, and so why don't we move on to Ron? And I don't see, so this will be the last call for questions for Jeff. How's that sound?
Yeah, hi, this is Bub O'Neill. Can you hear me?
Perfect.
Okay, great. I was late joining the party here. I'm on Central Time and screwed up my clock, which is not a good thing to do for a clock demonstration. I don't know if you can see my picture or not. My phone doesn't tell me.
No.
Okay, well, I'll describe what I'm looking at. I have a clock that I bought in England in 1974 from a clock dealer in Colchester, England. And he told me at the time that it was a composite. It was put together from several pieces, and it has a brass dial with a silver face. The face on it has deteriorated considerably. And my question for you would be, am I doing harm by having that face resilvered? Should I do it, or should I leave it alone for its antique value?
Well, okay, I'll give you my concept. I work with the folks at Colonial Williamsburg a fair amount. I've learned a perspective from them. If you go and see any of their furniture, any of their displays of anything, you will not find a piece of brass on a pull on a furniture, any of their clocks, anything at all that isn't perfect. And by perfect, I mean like it was made yesterday. The wood is polished. If it had lacquer on it originally, it's shiny. Their clocks, they do a complete restoration on them. And the concept of when you see your silvering worn off or brass dirty or wood dirty for that matter, That's nothing more than, we call it patina today to be nice to it. It's dirt. And no clockmaker ever made a clock with dirt. The enemy of a clock is dirt, because the mechanism has to function properly. And you get dirt inside that, it doesn't work. That's why when Ron held up the perfect examples that he had there of those brass movements, they were all bright and shiny. When you get a new one, like the one with all the hammers on it, if we order one of those today to put in a tall case clock, it's perfect. Comes out bright and shiny. So my comment to you would be, absolutely not. I resilver all of the worn dials, polish the brass, clean the hands in particular, because a lot of the different detail in the hands attracts dirt and different contaminants. And you want to get as much of that off and back to original as I think you can. That's my perspective. When I go to auctions, we go to clock auctions physically, as well as in the last couple of years with COVID. We do them online, of course. And the ones that bring the money are the ones that are restored, that the owner to be knows these are working, somebody took care of them, cared about them, and has them functioning. If you see one that has a dirty stained dial, case not cleaned, I've so many, I've opened up the bonnets on a tall case clock, and you see fuzz and cobwebs and so forth in there. I know it doesn't matter to me, because I'm going to take it apart, clean it, and get it functional anyway. But most people will turn around and say, well, that's the way it is. That's the patina. And the answer is actually, no, it's just the dirt. So I would recommend, if you're going to restore it and have it and use it, that you get that taken care of and get it resilvered.
Okay, great, great advice. Thank you.
It's not going to hurt the value at all. Clock guys, the insane ones, kind of like me, are going to want to see that somebody really did it right and took care of it. We have a company in Georgia that does a magnificent job on repainting, resilvering, repapering dials, the dial house. That's all they do. There's a couple of guys in the country that redo reverse painted glasses when they need to be done. And what adds to the value, or doesn't kill the value, depending on how you look at it, is that when you have a dial done, when you have a painting done, that it's done correctly. Not just, if I painted it, it's going to be paint by numbers. You don't want to see that. You want to see an artist redo it properly. Same with the dial. So you want to make sure you get it done right. That's the key.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for your advice.
You're welcome. Anything else?
Okay, thank you very much, Jeff.
Okay, you guys have a great meeting. Thank you. I enjoyed it. If you have any questions, Jim, have them get in touch with me. I'll be glad to help.
Okay, sounds
All right. Thanks, guys. Okay, bye-bye.
Ron, if you want to take over, that would be great.
Okay, I'll do that. You have my slides already?
Pulling them up.
Okay, we're gonna see several things that Jeff talked about in person. We're going to talk today about what I thought was called a Dwarf tall case clock. And Jeff referred to it as a granddaughter clock. I had never heard that term before, but it's the same size. He said about 4 feet tall. This one's 49 inches tall. So this is a picture of the clock case that I made, and had some questions online about where I got the, whether or not there were any of these small clocks in Tennessee. I like Tennessee, Kentucky furniture. We were considered to be on the frontier during the years these clocks were made. So I referred to my two sources, and I need to go. If you can let me show what I've got now instead of the slide, if we can do that. Yeah, there you go. This book right here, this is the Bible on Tennessee furniture, the art and mystery of Tennessee furniture and its makers through 1850. Excellent book. The section on tall case clocks. They did have tall case clocks here on the frontier in Tennessee in the 1800s. And they were your typical tall case clocks. Mostly the movements for these clocks were not made in Tennessee, although there were a few clockmakers in Tennessee. There was one in Nashville, he was a clockmaker and a jeweler. His name was Elliston, Mr. Elliston. And the clock on the left, he made the movement for that. If any of y'all are familiar with Nashville and the area out around Vanderbilt University, there's an Elliston Place right near Vanderbilt, and that's named for his family. They did mention in here that there were smaller clocks available that used movements that they imported from Connecticut. And those movements were then placed in locally made small clock cases. These were mantle clocks. And in the inventories of homes that came up from the sale of household goods, they were often listed as Yankee clocks. And there was at least one place where they did assemble clocks in Georgia. They imported brass movements from Connecticut and made the wooden cases in Georgia, and they sold them there. And one of the reasons they did that was if you brought in a completed clock and you were going to peddle it door to door, you had to pay a peddler's tax if it wasn't made in the state you were in. So to avoid the peddler's tax, they made them in the state so they could take them door to door. But you've seen a lot of these clocks. They're double weight driven usually. Very later on, they would have been spring driven. Then I looked at the other reference book that I like, which is, it's a great book, Collecting Kentucky, 1790 to 1860. And the Kentucky clocks were usually of a better quality, both woodwork and metalwork, than you would find in Tennessee. And the reason is they were closer to prosperous centers than we were in Tennessee. But in neither of these cases, in neither of these references did I find anything about a Dwarf grandfather or Dwarf tall case clock. So I did some more research when I was trying to decide how to build one of these things. I'd just seen the only place I'd ever seen one was at Peabody Essex Museum. They had one and I liked it. And I happened to have, I bought a shop out several years ago. This face in this movement were in the shop that I bought out. And I thought that was a nice little movement. I wonder what it's for. And I had it around here forever. And then when I saw the Dwarf tall case clock, I said, well, now I know what it goes into. So I started looking for patterns for a Dwarf tall case clock. And I looked on the National Watch and Clock Collector's site, and they had these plans on there for what they call a grandmother's clock. And it's the same height as this one over here, about 49 inches. Nice little set of plans. You can certainly build one off of this. So I ordered that from them, made a copy. And then I found out that Al Breed, of course, a very well-known furniture maker, he had the drawings for a Dwarf tall case clock. I ordered his drawings. That you can see them here. And that's where I decided, that's what I used to build my clock with. I had some trouble following some of Al's drawings. I think Al's a better furniture maker than he is a draftsman. But anyway, that's what I used. So I built this clock. We can go back now to our slides. Next slide. Okay, next one. Oh, this clock, while you're looking at it, notice that it has a French feet. I don't know if you've ever made French feet or not, but they curve this way and they curve both ways at the bottom. Well, how do you do that? Go to the next slide. This is a book that I think a lot of, and it's called Furniture Antiques Found in Virginia by Carlisle Lynch. And this is how you make French feet. You can make them on a chest of drawers, or you can make them on a clock, but they all work the same way. You split you can see where you saw into the lumber, into the foot, and then put a wedge in there that spreads it out at the bottom, and then cut a solid piece that goes on the other side that matches the curve. Put those both together and you've got a foot that curves both ways. Next slide. There's a close-up where you can see it. Next slide. This is some, you can see it put together. See on the left side of the foot, you can see another piece of wood. That's the added piece, added solid piece. The one on the right is the one that's got the wedge in it. It makes the curve. Right down at the bottom where you have the arrow, it's just right. And that's just a picture of the banding that I used around the bottom of the clock. Okay, next. This is the bottom part of the clock, the base, and I need to rotate it 90 degrees, but anyway, I wanted to break up that large area down there with something, so I put an oval, a crotch mahogany oval in it. And it's a crotch mahogany with banding made out of white, black, white stringing around it. Okay, the next one. And this is the clock itself. The hardest part on this clock is making the very top of it. This is why you want to have, okay, you can turn back now to my camera. And you can see you need to make some very accurate drawings. You've got several arcs. Where is it? Can you see the drawing on mine? Start showing up on mine.
We can see the main face plate and then the arch to the left.
Okay, you can see the drawings for it?
Yeah, I think, yeah. A single page, like 11 by 7, 11 by 8.5.
Yeah.
On the left, and then we've got the larger drawing on the right.
Yeah, okay. Those patterns, very critical to making the hood of the clock. You need to draw them out perfectly, and you need to make you some templates to make sure everything fits properly. Because up at the top, just a moment, let me put the hood back on. Hold on just a moment. Okay. Now, up here at the top, where you've got the arches coming together, you've got the arc of the door. You've got the arc of the face. You've got the arc of the arch. Those are not all the same circle. Those are different. They have different center points. And you have to lay that out on paper, like I did here, in order to get them right. And then make yourself a template, which you use to cut the wood. Just so happens that when I got Al Breed's drawing of the clock, I was checking to make sure that the face I had and the movement I had would fit his case. It fitted perfectly. Perfectly. Just lucky, I guess, but anyway, it fit it perfectly. Okay, next slide.
Sorry, give me a sec.
Sure.
All right, I think you should see it again.
So now you can see the hood set on the top of the hood set on the waist of the clock. And you remember that Jeff talked about a board you slid in there? There's the board. It's set in there that goes behind the clock case. Okay, next one. This is the arc. The cutting that arc around the top what I thought going to be the most challenging thing. Normally, when you build clocks like this, you can't cut them on a shaper and you can't cut them with a router bit. You got to do them by hand. You can waste out material with an overhead router or something like that, and then carve it back to match the straight moldings that you have on the top of the clock. In this case, I said, I think I can turn that on the lathe. So I made a disc of mahogany. This case is made of mahogany. Made a disc of mahogany, put it on the lathe, face plated it up on the lathe, wasted away as much of the wood as I could to get it close to the pattern. And I used a router bit. A router bit, next slide should show that. Yeah, used a router bit. As you can see, you can't use a router bit to cut that, but you can use it as a pattern. Let's go to the next one. There. And by the way, when you make this, you get enough for two. That the arc is less than a full half circle. And a friend of mine made another one of these clocks, and he used the other half of this. But you can see that piece of metal laying there on the hood. Yeah, that's a piece of scraper steel. It's a piece of old saw blade that I ground to the pattern of the router bit. Next slide. So I wasted away as much of the wood on the lathe until I got to the point where I needed to use this scraper. And I held the scraper. I had no idea this would work. Held the scraper against the turning piece of wood faceplate on the faceplate. Worked perfectly. Clean. It matched beyond my expectations. Matched up just right. And then you take the solid piece that you've got and you cut out this arc. Cut it on both sides till you get the piece to make the arch with. Next slide. Okay, this is the waist. Nothing magic about the waist. It's got quarter columns on it, and other than that, it's pretty simple construction. Next one. And this is the top of the hood with a scroll saw work up there on the top. I used Al Breed's pattern for that right off his drawing. It fit. It's no big problem. It's held in the back. It's glued to that center post and glued to the bottom post and the bottom two posts on the sides. And there's some glue blocks behind it to hold it in place. Next slide. There's the movement we talked about. Now, it's an old movement. This movement was from a company called the American Clock Company in Boston, Massachusetts. It is a nice old movement. You can see it's got, he talked about the thick plates. This one has thick plates on it. And it's sitting on a stand. And like this other stand I've got here that we'll look at in a minute, it's sitting on a stand. And the reason it's on that stand is I've got the pendulum laying there and I hooked it up and made sure that the arc of the pendulum would fit inside the case. You don't want to have the arc swinging so far that the pendulum wraps into the side of the case. So that was just a test stand I made to make sure that that movement would fit this case, and it did. All right, next one. I think that movement was made by a company in Boston, and that company is now out of business. I got this movement from my friend Al Lyman Jr., who lived on Lookout Mountain here, but was originally from Towson, Maryland. And Al passed away 3 years ago, I guess, and he was 95. And this movement belonged to his father, Al Lyman Sr. So I suspect, and he was a cabinet maker, amateur cabinet maker around in the Baltimore area. And I suspect that the movement, the face, were made probably in the 30s. It has a rocking ship movement. It's not on here, and I'll show you when we get it put together. But this movement, I'm sure, came from the 30s or early 40s at the latest. And the American Clock Company in Boston is no longer in business. Okay, next. This is a finished hood. Notice the windows at the side where you can look in at the movement itself. Somebody asked in one of the questions, was there any difference in construction of this little clock as to a large tall case clock? And I said, no, it really isn't. It's the same thing, same steps. Everything is pretty much the same. It's just much smaller. Okay, the brasses, by the way, came from Horton brass. See, next. Again, the bottom finished. And you'll notice the color of this wood. I made this clock probably 2-3 years ago. And we'll look at it live here in a minute, and you'll notice that the mahogany is darkened down. I don't put stain on anything. I let it age naturally. And mahogany and cherry take on a really nice color after they've been exposed to air and a little light over time. If you put a stain on things, it'll look great when you first put it on there. But 20 years from now, it's going to look black, like I'm sure you've seen old antique furniture, and you have to know, what is that? What kind of wood is that? It's all black. Well, it's because somebody stained it back years ago and it's gotten dark. Okay, next one. This just to give you an idea of the relative size of this clock. It's next to an Aaron Willard tall case clock that I made a few years ago. And you can see the difference in size. Okay. I think that's the last of the slides. Let's go back to my camera where you can see what I see. Don't know why that's not showing up.
We've got your, there you go.
There you
Now
go,
it's
got
good.
it.
Yep.
Okay, so here's the clock finished. I'm gonna take the hood off now so you can see the inside. And the hood is made to come off. And I put some little clips in the back to hold it. There are the bolts that go through that hold the base for the clock movement, so you can move it up or down as you need to. Big piece of poplar. Let me take the hood off. Okay. And by the way, I did not get the hood right the first time. This one didn't fit. So I had to redo it. But you can see how it's dovetailed on all corners. But it was not the right size. Here's the pattern that I used to do fretwork. Pattern for the opening. Here's the mechanism I used to do the scraping. Had a hand vise, clamped that piece of steel in there and laid that on the tool rest with just maybe a ½ inch of the steel sticking out to do the scraping. Worked well.
Ronnie, I was gonna ask a question about that.
Yeah.
You said that you couldn't use the router bit for that. Was that just because you didn't have a way to hold the router bit?
Yeah, it won't cut a curve unless you've got a piloted bit on it, and it will not get in there and cut.
No, I meant use that as your cutting tool on the lathe, just like you're doing the scraper.
Oh, could I have done it that way? You know, use this as the scraper?
Yep.
I didn't think about that, but I don't mean reason you couldn't.
As long as you could fixture it, right?
Yeah, as long as you can get it in there right, you should be able to.
I was just curious if there was a reason. Thank you.
It might very well work. I do not know. Okay, so see the movement. You see it on its stand, the movement support. The clock works. These are in slotted holes. The clock itself is in some slotted holes right here in the middle. So you can move the clock left to right, and the base it's setting on, you can move it up and down so that you get a perfect alignment with the holes on the front. This is a single train movement. Has 1, one weight driven train in it that just drives time only. This does not have a chime or anything, so it doesn't make any noise at the quarter hour or the half hour or the hour itself. It does not count the hour. Simple as you can get. Got one winding stem on the right hand side, and this is a rocking ship movement. You see the movement up there? It's connected to the pendulum. So when the pendulum moves back and forth, the ship rocks back and forth. Which is pretty neat. And see, that's about it for this little case. It's got some inlay on the front. It's got some horizontal mahogany inlay around the door, a little molding around the door. And this one has begun to change color, but not quite. You can see the feet are still, the bottoms of the columns, the bottoms of the quarter columns, see how much darker the mahogany is there? But in time, that will all be the same. It'll look the same. And I don't mind waiting for that. You can see the French feet, how they tilt out both ways. And let me put the hood back on right quick. The hood's made to slide on and off so that you can maintenance the clock movement. As Jeff mentioned earlier, you need to oil these things. You don't want to let them sit there for years and gather dust like he talked about and not be oiled. If you can oil one, it'll outlast you for sure. Okay. I also just finished work on another clock. This is just in the last couple of weeks. This is a Massachusetts shelf clock. And I had seen these before. And nowadays I build things because I like them. You know, if I like them, I'll build it. So I was down here one day and I said, I think I'll build a Massachusetts shelf clock. So I found some plans and again, I got some from Al. He had the overall dimensions of one, and that's what I used. The face is not correct. That's not the way the face would have been made. The face would have been, would not have had that chapter ring or brass ring around the outside. It would have been painted onto that white background you see, but I didn't do mine that way. And the reason is I had the clockworks and the face already, so I didn't have to buy anything. And it's weight driven, spring driven. It counts the hour and it chimes on the half hour. Let's see if it'll chime for us here. Or it actually drives a gong, not a chime. That's it. I made all of the bandings and inlays on it. I made myself. This is the satin wood. Where is it? Let me get down here. You can see it better. Yeah, this is the satin wood banding. It's got satin wood in the center and black white veneers on the outside. I used holly and black dyed veneer. And this is what it looks like before you cut off the banding to this size that you're going to inlay. And here's some smaller black white banding that I used down the side. I made that years ago. And I used the narrow black white chevron banding on the edge of the clock face, or the edge of the clock case upper, and it matches the same pattern but thicker banding or banding up here on the top. Just happened to be lucky enough to find one. Another thing that's I think unique about this that you can use in a lot of different applications. You notice around the clock opening there, see that little groove around there, little scratch groove around there. You see that a lot. There you go. See that? Well, you can make that with this. This is called a screw stock. Here's it. I can't find it on here. There you go. It is a screw stock. It's a piece of dowel with a screw screwed in it. Take a file it but flat off the top so you got a sharp edge right there. And that'll let you follow curved surfaces. Like this. Pull that around there and it'll lay a line parallel to the curve. And it cuts on the spurs where the slot was for the screw. The ends of that slot are sharp, and they just work great. But it'll just make a little line. Well, if you want to widen it a little bit, you can come back and use what I use is a riffler, an Italian riffler, which is a little small hand tool. Can't find it. There it is. Where did it go? Yeah, it's a small hand tool. It's got very fine teeth in it, and it's wedge shaped. And you can put that down in the scratch that you just made, draw it back and forth, and it will widen out and round over that scratch mark that you made, so that you get a nice little scratch around the outside of it, a nice little detail. You see that a lot on antique furniture around drawers and things like that, but that's what you use. This one is used for curved surfaces. But you can make a straight one just out of a straight piece of wood to follow a straight line, put a screw in it, file it sharp, scratch, and you can also run the screw in and out for how far you want the scratch line off the surface. Easy little tool to make and very handy. This clock has a single piece pine back, white pine. Don't see much white pine in the South, but that's what I had a piece back here and I used it. Let me show you some other things while we've got it laid out. Interested in clocks. The first tall case clock I ever made was this one, and you can tell it's old. It's on a blueprint. And this is another Carlisle Lynch drawing of a Eli Terry. You heard a lot of discussion today about Eli Terry. This is an Eli Terry tall case clock. Simple to build, no fancy curves on it or anything. Makes a nice clock. It's 85 inches tall, and the first one I ever made, I made out of pine. And the reason is I had never made one, so I made it out of pine, and it came out fine. I've made, I don't know, 4 or 5 of these over the years. And we talked about mechanical movements versus electric movements. I have no problem in putting in a high quality electric movement. And one of the reasons, well, a couple of reasons is you have to do anything to them. You don't have to go through all this business of oiling them and setting them and doing that. And they keep perfect time, and they'll run for, I guess, a couple of years. And you can also buy them nowadays with a triple chime movement or single chime movement, just like you get on a mechanical movement. So if you go buy a mechanical movement, you're going to spend a lot of money. The best places to buy mechanical movements, somebody asked me about sources of supply. Well, here's some. Merritt's, MERRITTS. Clockworks, Clock Kit, and the names you want to look for are Hermle, Ergos, and Canninger. Those are all German made. I think the best, I've got several Hermle movements, but the best ones are those Canningers. Those things are really good, and they usually are thick plated. We talked about the plates being thick. And if you want the very best, and money is no object, you need to get in touch with David Lindow. It's at LindowMachineWorks.com. he makes the very best, American made. But they are expensive. We've mentioned several times today about the dials, and the best place I know of is the Dial House in Dallas, Georgia. And it's dialhouse.com is their email, is their address on the web. And I've had some friends within the last couple of years that have used their services. First class, really nice, but expensive. So that's a good, 3 good sources of supply. If over the years, I was interested in clocks, and I had some old magazine antiques. You can get those things at thrift stores for hardly, sometimes for free. And I'd go through there and tear out the page that had a clock I thought I might want to make on someday. So I've got a pretty good collection back here in the file cabinet of clocks, as well as other furniture I wanted to make. Another source is the Furniture Treasury by Wallace Nutting. Here it is, Furniture Treasury. That comes in 3 volumes, and he lists good, better, and best of early American furniture. Volume 3, which is what this is, Volume 3 also has some measured drawings in it. And this one is for an Aaron Willard tall case clock. And Nutting says this is, in his mind, of course, this is the best proportioned tall case clock ever of the ones he's looked at. This is the best. And that's the one I made upstairs. I did have to modify it a little bit. The case depth from front to back was not enough to handle a modern chiming movement. That's why you make, this is the stand I made to test my clock movement. Mounted it on there temporarily, made sure I had front to back clearance, and made sure my arc of my plumb bar or pendulum didn't hit sidewalls. Didn't have any problem until I got to the depth front to back. It just was not enough. This one, I think the depth front to back is, 7 and 3/16. I had to make it like 8.5, almost 9, in order to get my movement in and have it clear to get fit the face, which you also have to worry about. But that's a good one. There are other sources. The Carlisle Lynch guy I mentioned earlier. That's his drawing. Here's General Lee's tall case clock, Robert E. Lee's clock. The original was at Arlington. It was taken by the Federals when they occupied Arlington and sold to a guy in New Jersey. He kept it a number of years, and then it was sold to a bookseller who opened a bookstore in is it Leesburg, Virginia? Is that where Washington and Lee is? Wherever Washington and Lee is where this clock is now. When he passed away, he left the clock to Washington and Lee University. They put the clock in General Lee's home that's there. And Carlisle Lynch made a drawing of it. I've made 4 of these, and they're out of walnut, made 4 of them. The original was mahogany, but I made them out of walnut. And the reason was I had some walnut lumber that came from the grounds of the Hermitage, Andrew Jackson's home in Nashville, some walnut. And so I made 4 of these clocks. So you've got General Lee's clock and Andrew Jackson's wood. My daughter has one, and 3 of my friends have the others. That's a nice clock to build. A lot of history there. He also has got a banjo. He has plans for a banjo clock, and these plans are available online. You can get them. And a Terry clock. He's made several Terry clocks over the years. I like the Terry clocks really well. They make a nice mantle clock. And he also has what he calls a country tall clock. So there are lots of different. Okay, the answer comes back. Washington and Lee is in Lexington, Virginia. I could not remember where. So you can see from all this stuff that there's lots of information out there if you just look for it. And there's lots of different clocks, lots of different styles, and everybody needs a clock. So I enjoy building them very much. If you got any other questions, I would be glad to answer. I think I answered all the questions that came out before. Let's see. Yep. I did that. All right. That's everything. You asked me if somebody asked me what I was going to be working on next. Got 3 dining room tables to make. And there's the wood for them. Cherry drop leaf tables. Near one of the legs over there. And I just finished this piece, which I am really proud of. It's a serpentine front chest. It would have been southern coast of Maine, New Hampshire. Al Breed built this. I saw it first time on the back cover of Fine Woodworking magazine. And I said, I got to make that. So I just finished it. Okay. Turn the camera back around. There we go. Hope you got a little something out of that.
Man, this has been an intense 2 hours. Thank you very much, Ronnie.
Okay.
But the question I've got is, I operate on a 24-hour day, and do you work on a 48-hour day?
Well, I'll have to tell you that I'm getting older. I'll be 78 this fall. And I used to work down here, 7-8 hours a day. And the reason is I like it. You're lucky in life if you find something you really enjoy doing. And I enjoy doing this. And so I'm down here, at least a few hours every day. Sometimes I don't work at all, but usually I come down and do a little something every day. When I was working, I was a construction engineer on a nuclear plant. And one of the big things is scheduling everything, blocks of work. When you're going to do this, how long is it going to take? So what I did when I was working was, I know I shouldn't say this, but at these, I'm sure all of y'all have probably been in meetings, these endless meetings that you go to where you may have 10 minutes worth of input to the meeting, and the rest of the time you're sitting there. Well, I sketch, and I was sketching up on the pad what I was needed to, all these little blocks that made up building a clock or building a chest of drawers, making little notes so that when I went home, I had my little block of work to do. So I divided everything into small blocks of work. I retired early because my wife was very ill, and I became a caregiver for about 12 years. That's all I did was I was a caregiver, and she required the assistance all day long. But we had blocks during the day when she would take a nap or the home health care people were here or something like that. So I'd have anywhere from 30 minutes to maybe 2 hours. And I had little blocks of work, and I'd come down here and do them. And that's how I developed the way I work. So I have really enjoyed it, and got a list. When I retired, I had a list of about 6 things. I said, shoot, it'll take me the rest of my life to finish those. I finished them in just about 6 months, and I still have a list. I've got, lots of things I want to make. So, I don't know if you guys knew Al Hudson, our oldest SAPFM member who died last year at 102 years old. Al's position was you should never get through. You should always have something out there ahead of you. And I think he was correct about that. And I've tried to follow that philosophy. Don't ever get through. You always got something else you want to do. If you get through, you just have to stop. So always have something ahead of you.
All right.
His other thing was such a hard craft to learn in so little time.
Yeah. Well, any questions from our audience? Has been pretty mild today, surprisingly so. And but any other questions? Okay. Well, I think that's about it. Thank you again very much, Ronnie, for all the time that you spent and the preparation that you did for this. It's really been worthwhile.
Hey, listen, that's what we're supposed to do in this group, is share what we know with everybody else.
Yeah.
I think it's important.
Well,
I have a question. I have a quick question, if it's possible. For Ronnie, the new chest that you just finished, did you get plans from Al Breed, or is that something that you drew up, or did you find plans for that?
He does not have plans for it. He does have a sketch or two, basically for the curve, the front serpentine curve. He had that laid out, and he had a little information about the oval inlays on the front, but they were wrong. His drawings didn't fit, so that were wrong. And other than that, no, I made a drawing. I'm going to have a finished drawing on it, but I don't want to interfere with Al's work. You know, if he's going to sell them, I'm not going to. But anyway, I did make a drawing, full-size drawing, laying out the drawer fronts and the height, which also didn't work. He said it was 41 inches tall, and the spacing on the drawers and the thickness of the blades, it didn't come out right. So I had to redraw that. So anyway, basically I just used his curve and made everything else.
Nice.
speaking of plans, you should check out the SAPFM website. Ronnie is not only built a lot of furniture, but he's got a good collection of plans that are available on the website too.
And there is a minor charge for those plans. However, all the money goes to the SAPFM Educational Fund.
Hey, I have a quick question if I can. For Ronnie. So Ronnie, when Jeff was on, he was talking about different thicknesses of the brass plates.
Yes.
Depending on the age. And he sort of did this. And I was trying to figure out what that thickness is. Do you have a sense of?
I can tell you exactly. Just a moment.
Perfect. Thank you.
And while he's doing that, I did notice that I missed a question during the earlier presentation about grain orientation on the wood gears. Not sure if anybody had anything to add on that one.
Yeah, Terry, Jeff talked about that, but it posed a question in my mind. If he has seen any gears that were segmented, you know, so all the grain would be in a radial direction. And so I'll follow up on that with Jeff and get it out to the group.
Thanks, Jim.
Okay, these modern clocks, plate thickness 1/16. The old clocks, plate thickness 1/8.
Okay. Thank you.
And when you're looking on, he mentioned this, I think, but when you look on eBay for a used one, ask the question, how thick are the plates? This supply of clocks, all these clocks I've got, I bought out a shop, and I think I got 12 movements back there, what you would call new old stock. They're still wrapped up in the paper like these two I had earlier. So I've got at least 12 more clocks I got to build with these clock movements.
Ronnie, I was surprised to hear that the plate thickness was a limiting factor there when you're putting a bushing in it. Seems like you could just simply have a bushing that was thicker because that's where the wear is. So what is it about the plate thickness that needs to be thicker?
Well, one of the things is rebushing one is no small job. Clock makers have a set of bushing reamers. You have to take a clock completely apart, get the plates separated, run a bushing reamer down through there, pick out a bushing liner that has the right OD and the right ID. You got to press that in there and then put the clock back together. And you can buy the clock companies, I think Marriott's, if they've still got them, they sell whole sets of those now, you know, just made for putting bushings in. And I had never heard that it made a difference between the plate thickness. I had never heard that, but Jeff knows a whole lot more about it than I do. But I would suspect you could put a bushing, you could put a bushing in a 16th inch piece of 16th 16th inch thick piece of brass. Those bushings are at least an 1/8 of an inch, maybe a little bigger. And the only reason I have any bushings is because it was in that bunch of clocks I bought. Yep. They're exactly 1/8.
Yeah, I'm sure there was a reason. I was just curious what it was that made it more desirable to be thicker, other than just having more to work with there and get the bushing straighter, maybe.
If you've got one of these old clock movements, it's got the 16th inch plates on them. Usually they come out of these used to call kitchen clocks that they sold around the turn of the last century. It is not worth your time to try to rebush one of those things. There's a plant in Korea that makes them, and you could order them online and get, a complete clock for less than you can buy the bushings for. Like this one is made by Gilbert Clock Company. It's an American made. This is a nice movement, but I have some other movements in there that are not very good. They're new, but they are Korean made, and the quality is not what this one is.
I do work for a clock repair guy, and I do the cases, and he movements or whatnot. And the American movements, like the Gilbert that you just showed, in that era, they're easily bushed, and they're like 1/16, like you said. But when it gets to the thin plates, like the German multi-sound movements, when you get to those plates that are thin, they're basically throwaway, because they're like tin can movements. And like he said, you can bend the 16-inch movement with your hand, but it takes a lot of force. It's almost, in your mind, it's almost like it was hardened brass, but it's not. But that's what you first feel like when you bend it. Where the newer Chinese and those German movements that do the multiple sounds, those plates are so thin that you can take them, you can rack them with your hand, just so easy. And that's why they're just basically throwaways after they wear out 5-10 years, depending on the amount of use. They're even thinner. And those are the ones that this clock guy, he does not bush them. He don't even deal with, he won't even touch it. He just tells you, get it out of here.
That makes sense. If they're that thin, like he was saying, that you could bend with your fingers, then rebushing it could very well deform it to where it's just never going to run right. Thank you.
And some clock guys, instead of putting a bushing in, they will peen the hole around the plate, and that will drive the brass in, and then they'll use those reamers to ream out that hole, constantly fitting the arbor into that plate, making sure to get rid of that plate. If that doesn't work, then that's when you would put a bushing in.
Yeah, that makes sense. But if you take an old clock movement and look at it and look at where the shafts come through the brass plates, you don't have any trouble telling if they're odd shaped, because the shaft will move right up and down. And if you've got that much movement in them, they're egg shaped, where they've worn down, always on the bottom, where they've worn down. If you've got a mixture of dust in the air and oil, just like a grinding compound, and it'll grind that brass right away. Yeah, I've got a couple back there that are useless because of that, and I'm not gonna ream them and put in new shim.
And an odd thing, talking about wear, an odd thing is when you have the verge against the wheel,
right?
That verge is usually made out of hardened steel.
Yeah, it is.
You polish it so it's like a mirror to get the proper slide off the teeth. In an old clock movement, you'll see a groove worn in the steel, but the brass fingers are fine. So the brass actually wears away the hardened steel because of that slamming that you hear.
You see this? This is the wheel right here that
strike. Yep.
Or the strike. And this little lever right here, it's steel. That's brass. And it will wear, that little thin piece of steel right there will wear a groove in it.
Yep.
You wouldn't think it would, but it will. I just worked on one the other day that this piece had to be replaced because it had a slot in it, and it would go down into the brass wheel, and it wouldn't come back up because it's locked in there. Yeah, I've seen that. But gosh, think about how many hours it would have to run to get to that point.
Right.
Yeah, and keep in mind, you're always going to put the hardest surface on the part that is always in contact, as opposed to the distribution on the teeth.
Here's the verge up here at the top, and it's hardened steel, and the little wheel is brass.
And one of the repairs for that, if you can't buy it or get a new verge, is you take a razor blade, an old razor blade,
Yeah.
and you break it and then silver solder it to the face of the verge. And now you've resurfaced with a hard steel.
That's a neat trick. Jim, there was a question about whether the slides are going to be made available from Ronnie's.
What I'll do is I'll put the slides on the SAPFM website. And then if anyone wants, before that happens, if anyone wants them, just shoot me an email and I'll shoot them back to them.
And now I know what this is for. This says low melting point silver solder for clock repair. So if you were going to use that repair you were just talking about, I've never used this. This is the stuff you use.
Now, Ronnie, does that have a flux core to it, or?
Yeah, yes, it does. It's flux core. It says it is.
Okay.
Acid core. Oh,
Okay.
yeah, acid core.
Hey,
Thank
Ronnie,
y'all.
have
Thank
y'all,
y'all.
have you bought a movement off eBay and was able to successfully get a clock face made for it?
I have made my own clock faces before using my drafting equipment. I was in school back when they taught drafting in college. So I've got a whole set of Dietzen drawing equipment, which has a lot of compasses in it. And so I used India ink, put it in, made my own circles for the time ring. Came back with a speed ball, the speed ball pins for put the India ink and marked them all the way around. And then had there's a lady here in town that's a pretty good artist, and I had her do some flowers and things in the corner. So I have made them before.
Was that paper one, or was that metal?
It's metal. Yeah, I used a piece of sheet metal,
Right.
and I primed it with 2 or 3 coats of primer, sanded between each one, and then an antique white spray on, sanded between each one with about 3 coats of that, and then used a piece of Scotch-Brite pad to knock all the sheen off of it, and it looks old. And because you've used that Scotch-Brite pad on there, the India ink will go right on without running off. If you use India ink on a really slick, flat surface,
Right, it's
it'll
going to
run
run.
all over.
Right.
So it's got
It's water-based. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Also, Barry,
If you know anybody in the business of pinstriping cars, they got all that equipment. They can
Oh, yeah.
make a face using real paint.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Also, Barry, Aspen's article in the 2019 period furniture journal, Art and Application of Clock Imagery, she gives a short discussion of inking faces too. So another good resource.
All right, cool. Thank you. Thank you, Jim.
All right. Anything else? Okay, that's about it. Once again, thank you very much, Ronnie, for all your help. Tremendous.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And once again, we'll have the program on the SAPFM website here in the next week or so. So anyway, have a good weekend. Pulling weeds, mowing lawns.
It's It's dogwood winter in Tennessee. It's 45 degrees today. It was 80 day before yesterday.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you all. Very good meeting.
See you.
See you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Okay, night.